What's up, Joe? What's up, everybody? Jeff Fannell, Sports360. As the coronavirus seemingly refuses to loosen its grip on our nation, the mental health impacts caused by the virus continue to mount. As a result, it's vital that we implement affirmative steps to mitigate or even avoid the harmful effects of COVID-19 on our mental health. Today's guest, Dr. Marvella Bowman, offers practical guidance that professional athletes, younger athletes, and ordinary, everyday people can put into effect to protect our mental well-being. It's a timely conversation, and it's next on Sports 360. Joining me today on Sports 360 is Dr. Marvella Bowman. Dr. Bowman is a clinical psychologist who joins me today to discuss the mental health challenges associated with the coronavirus pandemic and how professional athletes and the broader population can effectively deal with such challenges. Dr. Bowman, welcome to Sports 360.
Thanks for having me.
I'm grateful to have you. I'm grateful to have you on. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and without putting too much pressure on you at the outset, I really do believe that there's a great potential for us to, through this conversation, to provide some valuable information to our audience on how to deal with the mental health issues occasioned by this virus. And I'm sure you'll get into, the extent of that impact on mental health. But I certainly wanted to have you on to go through these issues with us, and then also too to provide some help for us all to deal with it, or helping loved ones deal with it. So I'm really grateful to have you on the show today. And as I see it, Dr. Bowman, I think there's no question really that there is a growing psychological toll being exacted upon millions of people because of the virus. And I think when you add to that the unrest in our streets and the general uncertainty that we have about our future, both as a country, as individuals, it seems to me that that toll is exacerbated. Um, I guess I'd like to begin by just asking you to speak broadly, if you will, about some of the potential effects of the pandemic on mental health, if you could.
Yes, definitely. Well, just generally for all of us, any change in routine can have a great impact on our functioning on all regards. So you would recognize it in even your physical health, your mental health, just all aspects of your behaviors. What we're creatures of habit. So when those habits shift, even when we are the ones creating the shift, it can cause some stress. Now, being that the COVID crisis and this global pandemic is something that no one really anticipated or expected. Just the shock of what may be very drastic life changes occurred fairly quickly, and that will always lead to stress. As those of us who study psychology are aware of the negative impacts of any stressors, and we consider things like stressful life events. They don't necessarily have to be bad to be impactful or to cause us distress. But in this case, we have not only the fact that there's something that was unknown and unexpected that happened, but the fact that there's a fear associated with potentially contagion or passing along a disease. Some people experiencing grief and loss around not only the loss of their routine, but actual loss of family members, friends, loss of connection, just a variety of things. So much happened within this one event. You can't even just look at it as one event. Then you think about the potential for economic impact, and so people have lost jobs or have lost work, or those who are essential workers are, pushed to work more. So just a variety of things, and the best way I can describe it is if multiple major life changes occurred all at the same time. And so we know that that will increase stress levels at any point in time for any person. I don't believe there's anyone who has not felt the impact of what has occurred recently. So I think if we just think of it in terms of stressful life events, there's a definite impact because the crisis has caused multiple of these.
Right. And, one of the things among many that I think about with the virus and our response to it and our being personal and also governmental is that, this idea of being in isolation, right? Because we've been forced in many states to stay at home, right? Many people are working from home, and even if you have family or kids, that brings some added stress, right? Because you have to juggle working from home, other people being home, your kids being home. That there was schooling going on at the time from home as it was done remotely. But also, too, there were people who lived alone. And for example, I know someone, Dr. Bowman, who wasn't affected physically. No one in their family was affected. The person didn't lose his job. He was working from home, but he was by himself. And he discovered over time that he was even feeling the stress, perhaps just of the isolation. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of it?
Definitely. We're social creatures as well, and as much as even if you self-identify as an introvert, for example, there's still some level of human contact that's just necessary for increasing our well-being, and that's overall well-being. Studies have shown that even just physical touch, whether it's a handshake or a hug, those kinds of interactions can improve our functioning and our longevity, all of those things, our health. Everything's impacted by just that social aspect. So even thinking about, I work in the prison system, and thinking about what the punishment is, it's isolating you from others so that you don't have that contact with others. So it's enormous to think about just being by yourself and isolated in such a way, particularly if you're not in a place where you can have any easy form of access to others. Those of us who live maybe in apartment buildings have a very different experience from somebody who might be in a house and the next house is a couple of miles away. So just a variety of possibilities. I think in many ways, the things that you will find out about yourself in those times, you'll learn a lot about yourself being by yourself, but it can be very damaging if there's no form of socialization. And of course, we've used things, thank God for, the fact that we have phones and online apparatus and technology is what it is right now, that we can have some form of contact if possible. If we have those items, if you have a laptop or you have a smartphone, things like that, you can still see your loved ones and connect in that way. But there is definitely something to that human and physical connection. And many of us build our lives around different social activities, whether it's, going to church at least once a week, or going to hang out with coworkers after work at the end of the week, things like that. So again, it goes back to just that whatever routine we may have had is no longer the same.
Right. And you hit on something that I was going to ask you about, and that is that, in addition to, staying at home and losing out on that social contact that you just mentioned, the uncertainty of jobs, or maybe even losing jobs, losing loved ones, your health being affected, and so forth. Um, Even if you are fortunate enough to not be touched in that way, um, we've also lost things that, or activities that contribute to our well-being, right? Like going to the gym,
Right.
right? You mentioned going to church. maybe even support groups where I think, there is certainly, something to be grateful for in terms of Zoom or the technology, as you mentioned. But for me, I don't know if it's just me. I tend to doubt it, but I think that there's something to be said about in-person contact. You know what I mean? I think there's something to be said about, looking someone in the eye, or even as you said, a handshake or a hug or something like that. Those things, you can't duplicate those electronically, and so coupled with all the other things is like some of the things that actually just contribute to our well-being overall, under every circumstance, that's been taken away on top of maybe, a job or other things. That seems to me to just double down on the challenge.
Definitely. And it's in this time where even if you are able to work, for example, or if you are going into the community, it's we're told not to make contact, right? So in order to protect ourselves and in order to remain healthy, we're told not to make those forms of contact that, people who are typically isolated might be able to find some interaction at those places that you mentioned, whether it's a church or a support group or, even maybe you have like a gym buddy that you go meet up with, and high fives and handshakes and things like that are very encouraging. And so just even now when we may be able to have an interaction, things that you might have been able to do, you're no longer, maybe even if you're willing to do it, other people are concerned about it. So it's an awkward place to be in for everyone. So that just kind of adds to the stress and anxiety level, and uncertainty. I think it just kind of lends to this feeling of, or it can lend to a feeling of hopelessness or helplessness. It doesn't have to, and it's actually, and we might get into this later, but a lot of people are quite resilient in this time, and though these electronic means don't replace the face-to-face interaction, it is helping. So early research is showing that it's being helpful and that people don't feel as lonely as people would have expected in this time. So that's encouraging that we have these substitutes, but I don't know that we will know the full impact in just this amount of time. Some years to come, we might find out something different, but early research is showing that it's been protective or helpful to have these other means to replace that. So
Sure.
it's not as if all hope is lost.
Yeah, yeah, and I know for me, I mean, there have been times when we've been able to get on the phone as a family. You know, my daughters are in different locations, and other family members are in different locations, and then to be able to get on the phone with them, to see their face, to talk, it's been good. And sometimes, to be on the phone for an hour, 2 hours. We actually early on, as a family, played Monopoly by Zoom. Right?
That's cool.
And so, creativity is being, developed, right? You try to find new ways to connect. And I think those things are good. But yet, having said that, I think, there have been some people who are zoomed out. You
Yes,
know what I mean?
Zoom fatigue is a thing. It's a real thing.
Yeah, yeah, okay. That's a better term, Zoom fatigue. Um, Dr. Bowman, let me ask you this though, because something that strikes me as, I'm going to use the word cruel. It seems cruel, in that some of these things that you're talking about related to the virus are challenging enough. They can impact us in so many ways, and yet in this country, in particular, the unrest on the street following, the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and others, and it led to you know massive unrest that continues in terms of protests and everything else. Um, and it seems to me that on top of the COVID related mental health challenges, that this also could, increase stressors. What is your take on that?
Well, it's definitely an increase in stress. I think in a lot of ways, attention was just available. So it's not as if such incidents had never happened before, but because the world is, as it were, somewhat of on a pause, I think those incidents and those events were just glaring or became glaring at us. And I think the nation's just in this kind of self-reflective reckoning right now. And regardless of what one personal stance may be on, race relations or the current events of, the variety of protests and what may have happened as a result of them, I think there's just an unease, a general dis-ease that's resulted from everything happening. I think heightened negative emotions are just, it's much more easily triggered right now because of the kind of lack of routine and kind of the, I guess the best way to say it, like I said before, the world is kind of on pause in comparison to how it was before. We don't have a lot of the distractions, and whether the distractions are good or bad, each person can put their opinion on that, but we had a lot more to pay attention to. And now it's like we're kind of forced to focus on something that's not so positive. It's actually rather ugly, right? Racism and these kinds of matters that are painful, just in general, whichever aspect or whichever way you look at it, it's a painful thing to think about. So that adds to the stress, obviously. Again, another change, another difference, another thing. And though it may not be a change per se, somebody who's been, kind of fighting against some injustices for a long time may not feel as if this in particular is different, but it's a change for many people who hadn't seen it to the extent that we've seen it recently. So that's just another stressor for every individual that is trying to teach their kids what is this all about, what are people upset about, that's trying to manage their own personal emotions behind what has gone on, the fears about may something happen to me or a friend or family member, those who are in the armed forces, or not armed forces, but in the police department or related to police officers, and what might happen to them if the call for defunding the police is heard, things like that. So there's a lot of different, and runs the gamut of stressors. So people have a lot more like compound stress and compound anxiety going on.
You said a lot of interesting things there, and especially when you talked about the family members of police officers and the officers themselves, but the family members, having concerns, as you spoke about, like with defunding, because it's really interesting, right? Because sometimes you don't think of that side of the coin, but that's an interesting point. The other thing you said that I totally agree with is, and I think you used the term that we were on pause, or the world was on pause, and that may be that focused attention on the more recent incidents, and especially the George Floyd
Yeah.
incident. I believe is something, like you said, it's not new, right? But the world was on pause, and so we had an opportunity to really, not be taken away by distractions, and to focus on that. The This leads me to something else, because, and I want to get into now just talking about different groups, and as we talk about athletes, and then also too what we can do overall, whether you're an athlete or not, to deal with these stressors and deal with the mental health issues, because we want to end in victory here. But I think about African Americans, right, who are disproportionately, the reporting has been clear, right, disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus, right? In terms of sickness, death, healthcare availability, and so forth. And then, we had these incidents that we talked about. And, as an African American myself, and you're African American, I mean, these things concern me personally. Is there anything that you can offer in that regard to, for those who may be feeling this disproportionate impact, because you're part of a community, a sexual worker, or whatever? Any advice you can give there?
Yeah, I would definitely let people know, and I think this will expand to anybody can do this, but particularly for the African American community and those who are more significantly impacted by just about everything happening right now, right? So number one is to pay attention to yourself. So we have a lot of different things that we're stressed about, angry about, anxious about, all of those things going on within us. It's important to take time and recognize what the feelings are and experience them. So it's not every experience that we need to avoid. So I think back when everything was happening and we were very fast paced, we would kind of hide from our emotional states by engaging in a lot of different activities. And that in and of itself wasn't bad, but in a lot of ways we never reckoned with certain emotions that we might have been feeling. So if it's necessary to take a moment and step away from, children or things like that and cry, it's okay to do that. Don't shove or stuff feelings, which is kind of what people tend to do in order to be strong or to put on a good face. Acknowledge that there are different emotions there and express them in some meaningful way. Also, we know we don't have like face-to-face maybe, and, in some households you may, if you have, family members that live with you or things like that, having discussions that give you a space to vent some of that, and where family members may be absent, that's like utilizing a Zoom call or something like that to kind of say, we're going to have this conversation about this and put parameters around it and, buffer it. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as to kind of how to enter and exit those types of conversations. But to be sure that it's okay to have the conversation, that it's not always, that you're not always on a battleground about these issues. A lot of people have taken to social media to argue points, and that's more stress inducing. So definitely having opportunities to vent and communicate with like-minded individuals and to kind of have that safe space to express emotions and thoughts and things of that nature. And then lastly, I would say what I've seen a lot of people find effective is to find that one arena in which you feel as if you're being useful. So, for example, for myself, it might be participating in things like this where I can utilize some of my skills to be helpful to others, and that gives me that sense of meaning and purpose that can sometimes feel a little lost in these times. And, not everybody's a psychologist that's going to talk on a podcast, but, whatever area that you might be able to be helpful in or useful in or give back to the community. I think that's why many of these marches were so well supported, because people wanted to do something. But everybody does not need to march. So, whatever area you can find to feel as if you're useful and helpful and a part of solutions rather than problems, that also gives people a sense of well-being as well and improves mental health functioning.
A lot of what you just mentioned seems to require some purposeful thinking, right? That, in other words, you just can't, I'm amazed sometimes, and I'm just going to tell on myself here, of how often I don't pay attention to myself. You know what I mean? That I'm running, and you realize something. You realize you haven't eaten. You realize you haven't been sleeping. You know what I'm saying, Dr. Bowman? There's times when we don't even seem to be paying attention to ourselves. And so that was the first thing you said. You said, pay attention to yourself. And that to me, for some may seem like it's a throwaway line, but that is so important, because I think if we really stop to think about it, many times we don't pay attention to ourselves. We don't pay attention to our bodies. We don't pay attention to a lot of the way we have been reacting to people or what have you. Um, and so it seems to me like a lot of the things that you were talking about does require attention, does require some purposeful thinking. And with all the things that are going on, as we were talking about with the virus and all the concerns, it seems that's a particular challenge to kind of weed through all of these uncertainties and anxieties and to be able to pay attention. Anything there that, could help sort of get to that point so we can do some of these good things that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think being intentional about setting aside time for oneself, and however that looks, it might differ for each person. But as you mentioned, like you may just be going, going, going and not recognize that you haven't eaten or slept. In the absence of routines that we're used to, so yes, maybe you got up and went to bed at a certain time because of a job that's no longer functioning in that way, so that's thrown off, and your kids are no longer going to school, so that's kind of throwing off that schedule. But maintain a schedule. You don't need the outside force of school to create a schedule, so you can create a schedule in your own home. And within that schedule, afford some time for yourself. Some people would call that quiet time. Some people might use devotional time. Some people might just say it's time for mindfulness and deep breathing, whatever works. I know we're going to be talking about athletes, and a lot of workout routines have been drastically different, but maintaining some type of movement activity. But you can incorporate in that, whether before or after, stretching and cool downs, you can incorporate some mindfulness and mental health exercises, just things as simple as recognizing how are you breathing at that moment, what thoughts are going through your head, and using some of your activity to maybe clear out some of that or move some of that to a different place. So if you're feeling really angry and upset about something that you saw in the latest news cycle, okay, maybe it's right before your exercise time. Take a few moments before your typical stretch to kind of think, okay, I'm angry, I'm feeling this way, take stock of what's going on, and then utilize that knowledge. Say, okay, while I'm working on my muscles, I'm going to also work through some of what's going on with me mentally. And those are just some examples, but any time that you take where you set aside and say, okay, I'm going to focus on this, that's beneficial, whether you do it for 5 minutes to start out with, or some people have very extensive routines of just kind of self-reflection and journaling and things like that. So any way you can find to kind of access what's going on. There's so many ways to do it, but I think each person has to find what works for them. So like, I wouldn't just say, oh, go ahead and journal if you've never written and don't like writing.
Sure.
Or, if you are not an exercise, like I'm not big on exercising. It's bad. I need to get back into it. But, I'm not going to tell me to go and start running marathons outside. But there's something,
Right.
I can get up and stretch. Like that's not outside of the realm of possibility for me. So I think finding things that are doable, that are not going to be an added stressor. I think that's the largest thing. If you consider what you're doing for yourself to be like some large, huge undertaking, then you're not likely to persist. So starting small and just doing something to acknowledge what's going on. Some people are good at tracking things. Some people, especially people trying to fight the quarantine weight gain,
Mm-hmm.
have been tracking their food. Track your emotions, track your sleep habits, track different things. And it doesn't have to be exact. You can set an alarm on your phone when it dings, just kind of write down what emotion you had. You can type it in your phone and kind of look at it at the end of the day. What's been going on, and just kind of process through some of that at the end of the day. If you have a partner that you're doing some of those things with, I know a lot of people are trying to partner up and doing little challenges, whether it's drink this much water challenge or whatever else. Incorporate some, let's have a little talk about how we felt today.
Mm-hmm.
Those things can be helpful.
Yeah, and I think what I'm taking away from that one is that there are a variety of things that we can do, and that can give a ray of hope to someone who may feel overwhelmed, right? Because they may think that things are just out of control, but there are some steps, as you pointed out, and they vary, right? There's no cookie cutter approach to this, but there are some things that we can do to better monitor ourselves in the area of mental health, and so that's some good advice there. I would like to talk about athletes a little bit. Beginning with professional athletes. I deal a lot with professional athletes. I've worked professionally with professional athletes for over 20 years now. But I also would like to talk about other athletes, whether it's on the collegiate level, scholastic level, youth level as well, just touching on it because, um, I think we tend, athletes are competitive, especially the professional athletes. They're super competitors. And you mentioned something earlier about, you don't have to be strong. And I found that interesting because with professional athletes, sometimes we have to save them from themselves because they go out there, they're used to pushing themselves, you know, beyond normal limits, whether it's physically, emotionally, and even perhaps psychologically. But, back in March, NBA, NHL, Major League Baseball, they all shut down because of the virus. And now all three of those sports are looking to resume play while the virus is spiking
Right.
in various states across the country. But I'd like to deal first with the shutdown and with athletes because you mentioned earlier about routines. Athletes are definitely people of routine, but they also have some other elements of their profession, right? Dealing, playing before crowds, dealing with the media, having a lot of attention on themselves. Um, are there anything that you would, as you look at a potential athlete or whatever, to see that their situation is as it regards mental health um, may need some special attention, or are the things that you're mentioning and have mentioned, uh, just simply applicable to them as well?
I mean, I think many of the things would apply. What I would say more so for, as you just said, athletes are, they're highly competitive, professional athletes in particular, and just have a bit more that they're used to. So, for your average person, yes, a whole lot has changed. For everybody on earth, right? A whole lot has changed. But for a professional athlete and celebrities, all those kind of things, you think of the distinction. I think in a lot of ways, some people may welcome some of the quiet in terms of, okay, I don't have a camera in my face every 5 seconds. I don't have questions being
Hmm.
asked. And that might have been the earlier kind of relief factor, a little bit more time with my family. But then the other side of it, I would imagine some concerns that I would have would be how do I keep up to the level that I'm supposed to be in the event that we come back? If I come back, am I going to have injuries? I don't have all the, those kind of things. So I think there's a different type of anxiety that's associated, whereas, somebody who might not be working at their regular job but can do some things from home, in the same way that that person is kind of uncomfortable and disconnected, they probably don't have any concerns about losing the same amount of ability that they had
Right.
to do the job in the workplace. But for an athlete, depending on their age, depending on their ability to do the same level of type of workout and all of that, a variety of things can happen between in off season by itself, and this is greater than an off season. So, I think there's a higher level of concern where as far as that goes, and then on top of that, considering the return of a season or going back to the field at this time, I know I would be horrified in terms of
Hmm.
what might I catch, bring home. We know that there's a lot of people who are asymptomatic, and an athlete themselves might not get sick. They might have the virus, but they might not get physically ill. They're in tip-top shape, but could bring that home to a family member who doesn't have the same level of health. So I think there's a lot of things that they have on their mind that other folks may not have in the same way. But I think some of the steps would be the same. I think the challenge that I would give to anybody who is, if you're an athlete, you probably have the ability to push yourself past a lot of different things, like you mentioned, physically and psychologically. It might be, I would say, or challenge that individual or those individuals to take some time to treat their mental health like they would their physical health. So if they're getting up, if they have, I'm going to imagine I don't think any professional athlete in particular, kind of just sat down and did nothing in this time period, right? There's an awareness that there's a season coming at some point. I'm going to
Sure.
keep my body in shape, right? So in that way, I think similarly, try to take some of that time to be as purposeful about mental health. And I think this is kind of just an overarching statement. I wish that our society did better in addressing mental health concerns with the same consistency or importance that we did physical health, because, most of us, even if we're not in any sports, we have annual physicals. Athletes get more frequent checkups and things like that just to make sure they're okay, so they can avoid breaks and they can avoid, there's certain things that you do to build up certain areas so that injury won't occur. And it's kind of the same mentality with mental health. Let's not wait until we develop a psychological disorder. Let's maintain our mental health and well-being. So a lot of those things would be beginning with acknowledging and recognizing, okay, what is it that I need? And I think for athletes, if they think of it in terms of the way that they keep up their physical health, think of the mental health in the same way. Okay, so I need to have recognition of what's necessary. What do I need? I need to acknowledge emotions. I need to know what's going on with myself. Since I'm not an expert in this, I need to find an expert that can help me do this well. And that doesn't mean like the most expensive person. You don't need a psychiatrist to prescribe medication right away. You could have a life coach. You could have somebody who just has some knowledge in relaxation techniques, different things like that. So, and there's so much available on the internet right now. You can probably go on YouTube and find some meditation or things like that just to do. But I think if we made it as much of a routine as the athletic routine, keeping up the physical body, that it was just as important, if not more important, to keep up the mental health and well-being, then I think they would be well on their way to doing a lot better and leading others in that way as well.
Yeah, I like what you said there. Treat your mental health, as your physical health. And whether you're a professional athlete or not, that's good advice. Because many of us, those who are taking care of their bodies, right, will put a lot of time into that and probably not as much time into their mental health. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum in terms of athletes. And let's talk about the youth athletes, kids who, right now, right, I can only imagine, everything has changed for them, right? School changed. Summer is different. There may not be summer camps. There may not be travel ball. They didn't play Little League this spring and so forth. And so you have the youth athletes and their parents, in this situation as well. And what about the kids? What are some of the things, and particularly maybe even talk to parents of how they can help their kids who are athletes, and who are missing out on playing their sports? How can parents help their children through this?
Yeah, a number of different ways. First thing I would say is it would be very difficult to try and have your child do well with the changes if, as the parent, you're not. So this, it unfortunately is not going to start with okay, what can I do for the kid? It's going to start with what to do for you as a parent, right? So the parent has to make sure that they're okay. And deal with what they might have going on within them. So also the parent might have about a kid that was gearing up towards getting a scholarship, and now I don't know if that's going to happen, and acknowledging that loss for themselves and letting that not be something that impacts their interaction with their child. But just acknowledging their own, the parents, every parent should acknowledge their own emotions around all these changes, and then leave a space for the child at whatever level they are to kind of express what they're going through. So, the loss for kids, it seems like kids, and often they do, kids are very resilient, they tend to bounce back, but what we never want to do, and I think it's easy sometimes as adults and parents to kind of dismiss kids when they're having their moments and count it as a tantrum or being a brat or whatever the case may be, but kids are losing or have lost a lot in this season. So giving kids a space to talk about it, at whatever age they're able to. If they want to cry about it, letting them cry, just talking to them. And if the time that it's happening requires some redirection, if it just offering reassurance. For many kids who might have been aspiring towards a particular sport or a particular level in a sport, making sure that the kid has an identity outside of the sport. That's a concern that I have in general with any high level athlete. If you tie your identity to your occupation or to your pastime, and then that goes away, it can be devastating. So making sure that the focus is not completely on, oh yeah, we got to get back to whatever the sport is, right? But leaving the opportunity where, if it's possible, if there's a hoop in the backyard, you use it. You know, if we can run drills in the front yard, like all the things that can be done, do them where they're possible. Just acknowledging that the child has feelings behind it. The parent needs to take stock of what's going on in themselves and then give the child an opportunity to tell them what's going on with them. And then finding other opportunities to engage in things that the child will feel some sense of mastery. And this will go, some of the things that I'm saying are going to go across the board. So you want the child to feel as if there are other things they can do, right? So if they're going to be really good at the board game, then they're the best board game players that you've seen. Oh, wow, this is amazing. So letting them feel accomplished in something else. If they're drawing, if they're doing some type of schoolwork, whatever it is, just kind of perhaps, hopefully, you know, in a well-balanced home, they're getting attention for those things. But if the focus has always been all the sports, and I've seen those families, I've seen them at church where they have to like leave early because they got to run to this game and this or they're out of town next weekend. So that pace is definitely just very different. And so now discovering the family and learning about each other and taking time out to acknowledge some other skills that the children have is really important. And parents have to do that as well. Like they're not just the whatever it was, you know? So everything I'm saying for the kids would be parallel, but just take that time out to talk with them and give them space to share what they have to say. And I would say that's more so for younger kids. Teenagers may not want to say anything to their parents because they're at that age and they might prefer to talk to their peers. But, you know, just kind of having conversations or watching certain shows together and commenting on them or whatever the case may be, whatever the child or teenager can tolerate. Parents know their children. So, but definitely create the space for all those things to happen. What you don't want to do is just ignore it. And I think that's the most important thing that I would say for everyone. Don't ignore the potential for stress, anxiety, frustration, all of those things. And don't try and sweep it under the rug and move on to the next thing. There are times when distraction can be helpful, but without any purposeful intent to come back and circle back to addressing and confronting what ends up being the elephant in the room, you can really be causing a problem. So make sure, whether it's making a family time that certain things are discussed, making a family time to have certain activities in place, all of those things can help with the routine that has been lost.
Right. And you've given a lot of good advice across multiple levels, and in different situations. And, you know, whether, like just now, you know, whether you're a parent, how a parent can assist with a child, if you're a professional athlete, if you're an office worker, if you're an ordinary Joe or Jane. But at what point, what about identifying or becoming aware when all the things that you have done may not be sufficient? Like, so, that point where now you may need additional help, you may need professional help. What are some of the things, one, to perhaps identify when that point might be reached, either for yourself or for a loved one? And then here's the other thing, Dr. Bowman. It's not as if these are things that we know how to go about them. Like, how do you select someone to be of help? So
Yeah.
I guess it's a two-part question, right? How do we identify when that we might have reached that point, and then what do we do about it?
Right. Well, first, in terms of identification, and I will agree that it can be difficult because everybody's dealing with their own thing, right? So recognizing it in yourself and others can be difficult. But major things you want to look out for, whether it's parents looking at their children or loved ones, if you can identify it in yourself, which is why it's good to be mindful and note what your normal is. If you see major disruptions in things like sleep or eating, if you see major changes in attitude or response style. Now, some of that Some things you might be like, oh, well, that's a teenager. Teenagers are just like that. But things that go beyond what was typical for your child. And like I said, it's not that it's always an easy thing to notice. But for us, as those of us who are mental health professionals, what I always tell clients is, because everybody, and this is before the pandemic, but everybody thinks they have this disorder or that disorder. Like they like self-diagnosing because they hear about a couple of symptoms. Oh, I have this, right? What I typically say is it really boils down to functional impairment. And what that means is, what were you doing before that can no longer be done successfully as a result of these symptoms you're having? So the first step I would say is to try and put a routine in place. So if you've been kind of floating through this pandemic with no routine, create one, because it's really hard to tell if you can't do what needs to be done if you're not doing anything.
Right. Yeah.
You're not really going to notice any problems if you have no demands on you. So, and that might be for, the school time has kind of come to a close. I don't know, if people got summer school things for their kids to do. Most families I know are trying to have trying to keep some routine for their children. I think that tends to be typical. But then when you have older kids, or if you're just in the home by yourself, you can really just be doing nothing other than kind of rolling over and getting on a few Zoom calls a day, and then not doing anything else. So move towards creating a routine that you keep. If you have trouble with keeping yourself accountable, find an accountability buddy that will, whether it's call you or you have check-ins, whether, FaceTime or anything like that, just like, what did you do so far today? Just to kind of keep yourself on track and honest. So having a routine. While trying to complete that routine, if you're noticing you cannot keep up the pace with things that pale in comparison to what your life was like before, you may be having the beginnings of some issues going on, right? So, oversleeping, undersleeping, overeating, undereating. And again, some things tend to be typical. I think everybody's kind of overeating because they feel like there's nothing else to do. Or some people may be very super conscious about their weight. You have to know your normal in order to identify what's abnormal. So, and if that's difficult, then try to, consult with others that are close to you, even if they're not physically close, because they'll probably be able to tell you, like, oh yeah, when we have phone calls, you're so abrupt. You just cut me off. You never used to be like that. Those kind of things, and be open to hearing that kind of feedback. Now, if it comes to a place where you are recognizing, okay, there's a lot of things that I'm not doing so well in this area, I think it would be helpful for me to talk to someone. There are a couple of different resources. Right now, a lot of the legal aspects or delineation of finding services in your area have been kind of brought down because of the virus, and people are allowed to do a lot more provision of services across state lines and things like that. So online, unfortunately, if you have Zoom fatigue, sorry, this is another Zoom suggestion, but there are, and it may not be Zoom. If there's a good therapist will probably not use Zoom because it's not secure, but some type of online connection to have therapy sessions or an intake or things like that. Some good resources would be the American Psychological Association has listings of psychologists. And I'm not elitist. I kind of just think if somebody can help, they can help. So if they're social workers, most local places, if you're looking at your county health department, mental health services, things like that, can provide folks who are providing these services without having to physically go there. Most medical agencies, medical groups, in where I am in North Carolina, Novant is a large provider, and they have like a area on their page. Most of these places are highlighting these things. You kind of click on it and it gives you the options, and you can have like a virtual visit to kind of start that conversation. And so I would definitely suggest looking into those types of resources. Any national associations for social workers, psychologists, any of those type of mental health providers usually has a listing of people in your area. And there's other niche groups, like if there might be, there are sports psychologists, there are different types of people who aren't doing their typical role these days. So there are these different resources that you can reach out to and have virtual visits. And it's not that you necessarily have to already have, like, you don't need to diagnose yourself. If you had a physical illness and you're like, my stomach hurts and I don't know what it is, it's not like you need to diagnose yourself before you see someone. So in the same way with mental health, it's like, something's not quite right. If you think it's not quite right enough to require some attention, go ahead and seek that assistance. But I do recommend, obviously, if you know people that could point you in the direction of somebody that they approve of, that's always great as well. But in the absence of knowing somebody who can direct you to a provider, I would say to utilize your insurance company or the major health conglomerates in your area, or just looking online for resources and places that you can contact that might offer virtual visits. And some places might even have face-to-face at this time, as different places are opening, but with the spike that might change as well. So
Right. Well, that's like most of what you offered here. That's really sound advice. And so, like, I've really enjoyed the conversation here today because of the wealth of information that you provided, and because it's so important right now, and perhaps in ways that we don't quite understand or won't fully understand for some time. And you alluded to that earlier, that it may be some years before we really are able to fully assess what's going on. Because obviously, we're not even through what we're going through yet, right? We're still in the midst of this pandemic. So there's a lot of story to be told, but I do appreciate the wealth of information you provided us today, because I think it will be very helpful to all of us, no matter what our station in life, to heed some of the advice that you have given us. So, Dr. Bowman, I thank you for that, and thank you for taking some time to be with us today on Sports 360.
it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And I want to keep the lines of communication open so that if, as situations go forward, we can have you back again, because, again, I think that, you talked about resources, and it seems to me you can be a very valuable resource to us. So I hope you're open to coming back if the situation calls for it.
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Okay. Well, thank you again for stopping by.